Okay, I'm ready to go here. Today I wanted to do something a little different. Karen wanted me to do this presentation on numerical stability, and I thought that it would be more appropriate maybe just to talk in generalities about two-dimensional flood modeling and whether or not your simulation is accurate or is yes, has some reasonable final results. Go ahead and click on this. So the reason I wanted to do this is because I've talked with people sometimes about other models that are out there, and I ask them questions about how well their model is doing. And in general, I think people um, look at a final product that you have in terms of a model and don't know how to actually recognize whether it is possible to see that the model is performing the way you expect it to. So I'm going to run through some checks here with you. Visual validation, which we're going to do first, then volume conservation, numerical stability of the model, whether you're getting unreasonable output, and then just a few slides on troubleshooting, and finally a word or two about project review. Now, in all of these, I've been addressing these in the Flow2D model as it's been developed over the last 30 years or so. And at this point, I think we have a pretty good handle on all of these issues, and each one of them deserves a webinar, but and we have had webinars on numerical stability and project review and troubleshooting, and we'll do it again. But you can basically download these webinars on these topics here, and it will help you to get started. Now, in terms of visual validation, I think most people, when they finish up with a two-dimensional flood routing model, they may look at some pretty graphics or some animation or something, and it could be a really big model. Whether or not you have a mud flow in Flow2D, for example, or water, you can see the differences in the areas getting inundated. Does that mean that the model is running okay? Not necessarily. The same thing is true for, and again, I'm relying on you to address these with your own types of models, whether it be HEC-RAS 2D or some other commercially available model, on whether or not you're actually looking at reasonable results. Here's an instance where we did a model for Naples, and we have a hurricane. This is Hurricane Storm Irma, I believe, or Ian. And anyway, in Florida. And anyway, I wanted to show you that we did this model as both storm surge and rainfall because they occur simultaneously. And you can see the difference between the hurricane storm surge and when you apply only the rainfalls, and where is the water ponding, or where is it having some very high depths and so forth. You can look at whether or not the airport is being inundated. In this case, it's not being inundated by the storm surge, only the rainfall. So you might look at that, and is that sufficient enough for you to consider giving your model results to the client? And here's another instance where you might have storm drain, and you'll have to look at this detail, whether or not the storm drain is performing the way you want it to with the overbank flow. So here we're looking at a two-dimensional model that has channels, storm drain, buildings, streets, etc. And again, this visual validation of the model is excellent. You can get good graphics out of most of these models that are out there. I'll show you a little bit of graphics here. Hopefully you can see this, and if you can't see it, let me know, or if you can't hear, I'll take a quick look at the questions to make sure that I can see it. Okay, no question. So I'm assuming that everybody can hear me and can see my presentation. So in this case here, you can see that we have a model area, and we're going to zoom in on the actual project site. And you might look at this and get some general ideas as whether your model's running correctly or not. Here we have rainfall occurring in the upper watershed, and now it's raining at the same time down on the Flow2D model in this case, and you can see the water cascading through, hits different avenues, ponds against in some locations, and there's a channel running through this. It might store some water in the channel. So you want to ask questions. Is the model performing the way I want to? Are the areas that are getting wet the areas that I think should be getting wet in the model? And so you can use this kind of animation or any of the other mapping results to see whether or not it's appropriate. And here a wall fails or wall fails along here and the water comes down or it hits the berm along the channel. So this is really excellent tool to work with here, but the question still remains, how accurate or how good are these results? So I'm going to stop this now just because I just wanted you to see that you can use animation to identify whether or not you think the flood routing is appropriate. But more than that, sorry, I hit the wrong button here. More than that, you can zoom in on some simple tools. Here's the case of a flume, maximum flow depths. It's a ramped up, discharge is ramped up to like 600 or so and held there. So there's an inflow hydrograph, and the purpose of this flume test was to make sure that the channel is receiving water off the floodplain. And so I have a floodplain to channel model. This is the upstream end, and you can see that this is different depths. They're on the floodplain. This has surveyed cross sections in it representing the channel. This is for the maximum depths. Now, if you look at the final flow depths in a mapper or in your own mapping tools and so forth, you can see that, well, the inflow to this at the end of the simulation, because it was at steady uniform flow throughout the model at that point, or just steady flow, not necessarily uniform. And you can see like at the top of where the flow is entering into the model itself with a hydrograph, these water surface elevations at the end are pretty reasonable. They're only off by 3 or 4 hundredths of a foot. And you would expect that with a steady flow case that eventually they would all reach more or less uniform depths, but this is not the case because there is a lot of variability in the grid elements, and because the model's getting squeezed down here, you can see difference in water surface elevation of 4 foot on one side compared to the flow depth entering the channel in the middle, which is 4 feet lower. Likewise, if you were to plot the final velocities, however you might do that in your own modeling tools, you can see that there's a lot of variability on the floodplain here. The flow is not necessarily just going down the flume and running into the model. And part of this is because the available flow area at the lower end here is being choked by a narrow channel Thalweg. So that's if you look at this would give you an indication, well, maybe the results are not that great. I mean, I have a final velocity that's ranging from 2 feet per second to up to, let's see what the highest one is here, like 13 feet per second, or 13 feet per second. So, this is not such a good result. So let's go on now and determine whether or not it's appropriate to use some checks for any two-dimensional model. And again, I have to relate this to Flow2D because that's where all my results are. But this should apply to any model that you're using. So I'm going to talk now. I showed you that you might initially start with some maps or some animation or something, and it all looks terrific based on your mapping tools. But is the model running okay? And so let's take a look now at volume conservation. So is the model conserving volume? Now, in Flow2D, I give you this final dialog box that checks off whether or not things are reasonable based on my judgment in this case. If the model is going to have any model that's greater than about 0.001%, 0.001 of 1%, where the zero here is 1%. This is a thousandth of 1%. If this error shows up in or greater than this, then when you look at your simulation dialog box here, you see that there's both major volume conservation issues, both in the channel and on the floodplain. So we want to determine whether or not it's appropriate to produce these kind of results and to give a client mapping if you have some volume conservation error. And so the question you should be asking yourself is your model, whether it's Flow2D or another model, reporting on volume conservation errors. Now in Flow2D, there's a summary.out file, and hopefully other models are giving this too. This model was run for 3,600 hours and probably time output interval of like 1 hour or something, because it's almost over the course of a spring season, a week or two anyway. And you can see here that this is the volume conservation error in acre feet related to this model at the end of this 336-hour simulation. And this is a 0%. It's 6 millionths of 1% is the error, and it shows no error at all. And this is the ultimate disposition when the model is finished of where the water is gone, lost to infiltration, floodplain storage, and channel infiltration, and so forth. And the inflow hydrographs for this particular model, I think it was Rio Grande, had an inflow volume of 100,200 acre feet or so. And you can see that it matches the total volume of outflow plus the storage on the system within the nearest hundredth of 1 acre foot. So you can see that this is extremely good. And the only thing you need to look at is this. So volume conservation, when you run something over the weekend or something, you come in Monday morning, this is the first file you should look at. And if other models give you this kind of information, great. Not all models do. If you have a volume conservation error, the first thing that you should do is try to isolate the problem. Which component is causing the error? So you can easily turn off components in QGIS or in just the cont.data file with an ASCII text editor. And these are the switches. These are levee, ARF values, area reduction factors, storm drain, rainfall here, and infiltration, and then hydraulic structures. So you can turn these on and off without doing anything else by just setting these number ones to 0 and run the model again. Here's the channel on-off switch. Now, what I would do is note the time at which the output is showing you in summary.out that you're encountering a problem. Instead of running the model again for 336 hours to determine whether or not a specific component is causing the issue, just look at this and see that your error is starting on or before 0.04 hours of simulation time out of 24 or out of 48 or out of 336. So you should note the time of occurrence in summary.out. That's the first indication that you may have some problems with your data file. Um, it may make it necessary for you to further isolate the location if it's practical to do so. Now, let me say that volume conservation is an accounting issue. It has nothing to do with routing the flow through the model. It's adding up all the inflow and rainfall, all the sources in your model, and comparing it with what is left on the model. It's just accounting. If your model is not running something on the order of 1,000th of 1% or smaller, and in Flow2D, it's almost on the order of millionths of 1%, and it's completely zero. There's absolutely no error at all. If you can't do the accounting right in your model, I'd raise serious questions about whether or not the software is actually giving you valid output. So this is one of the issues. Now, if you got an error, if you check out ch volume for channel volume.out, you can see where the volume error is starting here, and it's pretty. This is an acre feet or cubic meters here. And you can see that it's pretty robust error here. Since I don't have any channel outflow or overbank flow or return flow to the channel or infiltration or evaporation or storm drain errors, this is just in the source. The error is in the source of the rainfall and or how it's stored in the channel. So there's something dramatically wrong with your data in this case. Another way to check on volume conservation is looking at the profile. This can be plotted in the profiles routine or in QGIS, and just see if you have a bad profile. Now, adverse slope, bed slopes, doesn't mean that it's a bad model. This can run. Flow2D doesn't care about adverse slope conditions. The right and left banks are plotted and the water's getting overbanked somewhere. If you're not expecting any overbank error, then that could be a source of a problem with volume conservation, perhaps. You can see where the flow is accelerating as the water gets steeper. There's a little bit of backwater here and instability where it's going over this, maybe a ripple or a riffle or maybe a rapid or something like that. But again, use your channel volume conservation. If you have bad volume conservation, run the model only to where the error occurs, and then you'll see how much water gets on the channel if there's an error with the channel. Another thing you could do is plot the channel hydrographs anywhere in your system. For each grid element that's a part of the channel system, you can plot these hydrographs. And if there is volume conservation error, sometimes it's related to numerical stability. And you can see here that this is clearly an unstable result in the channel. It's going up and down, up and down, up and down. So the volume conservation may be good. You could still have an error in channel instability. So let's take a look at what constitutes numerical error in the channel instability. Now, numerically, what's going on here is that if you have instability, the solution to the dynamic wave equation, momentum equation, maybe isn't converging. The volume conservation may be okay. However, the time step may be too large, and you might want to, before you do anything else, just lower the Courant number and see if the error goes away. And if you have a very small grid system, very small grid elements, and you have a lot of discharge, the water could be having trouble going up and down in those elements that may not have much storage left. In your model, maybe the numerical instability may not be reported. In Flow2D, if you get a numerical instability for one of the various stability criteria in the model, including the Courant number, you can get this report while the model is running to identify that this particular grid element is giving you too many errors consistently in a row. So you can continue with the model by decreasing the minimum time step, or what I do is just terminate the model, save the results, and start looking at whatever is listed here. Now, do I have numerical instability? Even if you didn't get that dialog box that said you have it, we have some other places to look for numerical instability. We can look at whether or not the velocities are unreasonable or the Froude numbers are excessive, whether there is spikes as I showed you in the computed hydrograph, whether there's maybe some adverse maximum slopes, which is physically impossible unless you have inflow to the channel. And maybe you can see the unreasonably high velocity in the plots that you make in your mapping tools. So in doing the numerical stability checks, let's start with looking at some unreasonable output. Now, your model may not provide this kind of output, but if it doesn't, it's remiss in helping you to find out whether or not you have some unreasonable maximum velocities. The vel time C for channel and vel time FP dot out are the maximum floodplain and channel velocities listed in descending order. So you can just look at the top few elements and see that they're on outliers perhaps with respect to the rest of the system, which is only 7 or 8 feet per second, or meters per second would be very fast and probably unreasonable. But if this is just feet per second, this is maybe not outside the realms of reasonable output. And maybe it's associated with the inflow hydrographs. And if that's the case, maybe your entire model is okay. On the floodplain, 1 or 2 elements here being outside the range of the rest of the grid elements on the order of 5 feet per second or so may not be unreasonable. This may be street flow, for example. But you have to decide whether or not this is excessive. If you look at this after your run is done, and these are all 20 and 30 feet per second here, or even higher perhaps, and you have an issue with only a few elements at the top being 20 or 30 feet per second, well, that's when you might want to cut bait and stop the model and try to address this. For super dot out, for supercritical flow, it shows you how high the maximum Froude number was and how many times it was encountered in a given grid element. You can do this for both floodplains and the channel and the streets too, if you're using 1D streets, which isn't used to much anymore. But and in a channel, a Froude number of 1.11 for supercritical flow with this grid element. If the channel in this reach is concrete lined or something, this may be okay. If it's not concrete lined, and it's a river channel, and you have an alluvial bed, this is probably an unreasonable result. Typically, I use 2 for Froude number on the floodplains because most of the time the depth associated with the Froude number is less than a half a foot or so. It's usually the shallow depths that will generate high Froude numbers. And if these are all streets, that may be appropriate. I would say up to 1.5 if it's anything on asphalt or concrete surfaces. 1.5 is probably reasonable in this case. Now, instability may also be viewed if you plot the maximum water surface and you see some adverse slopes in your maximum water surface here, here, little one here. This is impractical for flow that is just inflow from upstream and there is no inflow downstream. Even if it's a constriction, you should have your maximum depths without an adverse water surface slope for the maximum value. And the only way that this could actually occur is if you had a tributary coming in and the flow went upstream a little bit. Otherwise, if the flow is always going downstream in your model, having adverse slopes in the water surface, maximum water surface profile is impossible. It's a numerical error. And it's surging in the channel. And it's surging because the flow depth is getting higher. This is surging about 1 foot of maximum water surface elevation here in this model. Now, again, it wasn't my intent to go through numerical instability, we have entire webinars on it. I just wanted you to be able to identify whether surging was occurring. Some of the fixes might be slowing down the model, checking the bed profile or the grid element topography, adjusting the end values. And you can use the limiting fluid number in Flow2D to help you to adjust the end values. Also in Flow2D, you can apply a depth variable roughness, which may eliminate some of the instability in the channel. Or if push comes to shove and you're still having difficulty, look at your channel area, flow areas, or on the surface, the floodplain cells, and see if you have deep flow depths on the floodplain surface, or whether or not the channel itself has an immediate abrupt change in cross-section and without a comparable change in roughness, and that could be an issue. So again, I'm not going to go through these now today. I'm just trying to get you to be able to resolve whether or not your model is running appropriately. In general, if you have volume conservation errors, or just some areas of inundation that you may not like, it's the volume that controls the area of inundation. And I would start with a review of the hydrology, the rainfall events, duration and intensity, or the inflow hydrograph, which might be from an off-project area. Another model, say HEC1 or HEC-HMS, is developing your hydrology. So it's the volume that controls the area of inundation. Look, if you don't like the results in terms of the area of inundation, look at your source hydrology first, or inflow hydrographs. Conversely, the roughness basically controls the timing of the runoff and the floodway progression. So if you need to slow the model down some because you're getting instability, increasing the roughness is an appropriate thing to do. If you think that the timing of the hydrograph is off and it's delayed, then you may have been a little overzealous with your roughness assignments and you might want to reduce them somewhere. So for the roughness, you can adjust shallow end values and globally in the control.data file, assign spatially variable shallow flow end values, again, assign appropriate end values for streets and pavements, and you can turn off or on the depth integrated end values in the solution. What you should realize is that obviously if you're running through overland vegetation, so forth, your velocity profile is going to be a lot less, and this is a good case where a depth variable end value is appropriate. If you have a concrete line channel or something, it may not be so necessary to apply the depth variable roughness because it's a logarithmic, fully developed turbulent flow in your velocity profile. So if you think the channel is or the problem is in the channel, try to limit the problem to one channel segment. Or if you need to, only run the model until you encounter the volume conservation error or the instability. Don't run the model to the end. You can isolate the problem by reassigning the inflow and outflow channel elements to shorter and shorter reaches. I'll show you that here. You can either turn off some of these tributaries and isolate each tributary or each reach in your channel, say a reach from here to here where there's not much in the way of inflow hydrographs from tributaries. Or you can turn off the tributaries themselves, or just turn off the inflow hydrographs at the point where the tributaries start. Now, if you've narrowed it down to one channel segment, one thing you could do is to isolate which part of the channel is giving you the issue here. You can take the inflow node and move it downstream to a new element, and take the outflow node and move it upstream in the channel the outflow outflow node is in the output.data file, and assign a new outflow node here. So now you're only going to model the reach from here to here. If you do that, you might want to stop the water from going upstream here, and you can do that with the no exchange line here, and it just says no exchange grid number, E line and grid number, and it will turn it off. Now, in adjusting the data, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, you can use the QGIS to visually validate the data, or do a data validation on your own by looking at all the data files. So in QGIS, you have options for using some of the tools to plot, like channel slope or street slope and so forth, or just dig into the files a little bit and you might see some outliers or something. There are data validation tools. You have to know whether or not the validation tools in your own model that you're using, HEC-RAS 2D, for example, or some other model, whether or not you can look at the levee profiles and the street profiles. Maybe the elevation rendering will show you some depressions. Grid element Manning's n-value rendering and QGIS, which will show you where you're assigning very spatially variable n-values and how high or low they might be. Channel and street parameter editors, and the levee editor. So here's a levee profile along with the actual ground profile to see if the levee makes sense in terms of the crest elevation. You can, in QGIS or in the old GDS or in Mapper and other ones, you can visually inspect the components. Are the levees complete? Are you sharing grid elements between hydraulic structures and levees or something? Whether or not the confluences make sense. Whether or not there's flow against the boundary, and do you need outflow nodes? We'll look at this a little more closely in a second. Use aerial images to help verify that you're using the component correctly in a given location. Whether or not your channels and streets and levees are all aligned, and whether or not your buildings are in the right place. All of these can be looked at with your various mapping resources or Maximum or in the QGIS data file shape files. Now, mapping resources, regardless of what type of mapping, you can have some of the mapping that we showed you before, and you can bring this into QGIS too for Flow 2D, but something simple as MaxPlot or Mapper will allow you to examine whether or not the flow is moving around on the grid system okay. And you can then check for errors because the other tools may not open with some fatal data check resources. Another thing that you can do is you come in and you can see here that in summary.out, after a 4-hour simulation ran, and there was no error at all, absolute zero. And typically this is the kind of result you're going to get in Flow 2D these days. And if your model is not giving you either a report on the volume conservation, or it reports a volume conservation on the order of 1/100th of a foot or 1/10th of an acre foot, as would be shown here, you've got problems in your model that can be corrected. At the bottom of the summary.out file, it lists things like the grid element size, the number of grid elements, this is 1.8 million grid elements, and how fast the model ran. In this case, the 4 hours or whatever ran in just a little under an hour for essentially 2 million elements, or whatever the time output simulation time was, because these may not be the same project. But in any case, you look at this, if you come back in over the weekend, look at the summary.out file and see how long the model ran. Is this an appropriate time, or is it too long? If the model reports an output, simulation runtime of like 24 hours, and that's much too long for your model. It used to be weeks, but now we're down to just hours in terms of the computer resources we have. But review the time.out file in Flow2D. I doubt if other models will have this kind of output for you, But in this case, the number of times that a given node exceeded the Courant stability criteria are written to this file. Now, if you have a very long run that you don't like, go to this file and see if there's an element that's choking your model, or 2 or 3 that are choking your model, and review each one of these in succession. Same would be true for channel elements. And you can see here that this particular element, when the model was finishing, the last 100 time step intervals was all focused on one grid element. So I would start there to begin with. Select the top few nodes to address and adjust the n value to the topography or the slope or something. Maybe you have a limited surface area because there's a lot of buildings in the grid element or something. Let me show you an example of what I mean here. On a particular simulation, this was some time ago, you generally won't get this kind of number of time step decreases, but this particular grid element, 1,060,065, had time step decrements in which it exceeded the stability criteria 57,000 times. Also with a channel, do the same thing and look at this. But you can see here that the last time this model choked was on this particular grid element here. So let's take a look at whether or not this requires additional adjustment or not. So you look at the Bell time floodplain.out file, and you can see here that the velocities in feet per second, in this case, are pretty high for whereas the more moderate high ones are down around 10. This is like twice that. So I would start by looking at these, and it turns out that these are actually streets. So the flow is going down a steep, relatively steep street with a low n value at 20 to 24 feet per second. Is that realistic? What you want to do is get your hand calculator out, throw in a Manning's n value and some dimensions for the street, and see whether or not you know, with a particularly high or mild slope, whether these are appropriate. Now it turns out that this grid element that we said was choking the model, grid element number 65 here, 1,060,065, it's not listed in this with a very high n value or a very high velocity. So it's not necessarily surging, but it is slowing down the model appreciably. The question is why? So this was a fairly small grid element number here, whoops. And the grid element is located about here. So I'm going to import the data and zoom in on this in Mapper or QGIS or something and take a look at it. Here we see that this particular grid element is just off this street here, and the n value is 0.038. I think it's this element here, the arrow's a little off. Has a limiting fluid number of 1.35. Why is this particular element just off this resident or boulevard or whatever it is in Truckee or wherever we're doing? No, this was in California. This was one of the suburbs in Los Angeles. Why is this making the model to choke all the time? So if we go in a little closer here and zoom in on MaxPlot or Mapper or something like that, or whatever mapping tool you have, you can see here that up on the street, we're at elevations 151, 151, 151, 151, and we come down here, it's still 151, 151, 151. So on the upper part of along the street here, as it gets off into the brush alongside the street, the elevations seem reasonable. The n values are 0.035, 0.038, 0.035, more reflective of the street than the dense vegetation along the street. You might consider increasing the n values along this if the vegetation is very dense. But let's continue this review. Here I have 143 is the water surface elevation, 143, 149. So it's dropping over 8 feet, but remember these are 10-foot grid elements. So it's dropping almost 8 feet in 10 feet. That's pretty significant. But again, maybe the water surface elevation is not so high that it causes some consternation with these results. But if we go one more row down, here, these are 143, here 144, 149, 147. Here's 137. So it's dropping another 6 feet. So it's dropped 14 feet right down this one. And obviously what's happening here is it's dropping over this embankment into maybe a storm drain or some kind of culvert entrance in this meridian between two streets. But these may be realistic elevations. What you need to do is, if you have a slope that's almost 1:1 through the system, maybe make this 0.065 or 0.085 or even 0.1 here, because it's tumbling through this vegetation. It's quite rough, and the high velocities or slowing this down through here may make the model more stable. So you could import DTM points, look at elevations, review this in the field, and then adjust some N values if you need to. So this is another issue that you would have with any required 2D model, is if you've got some unreasonable output now, you should be looking at, can I troubleshoot or debug this? A little editorializing here. Just like this picture. So let's start with some troubleshooting hints. And again, I'm not going into a lot of detail here. I'm just doing this so that you have an understanding with your 2D model, whether it's Flow 2D or another 2D model, whether or not, how you approach this. First, identifying volume conservation errors, then maybe looking at channel stability, and then we'll look at what to do if we see some of these issues. First of all, you should only run the model until the error occurs. Don't run it overnight or over the weekend. If the error is occurring in the first hour or something, cut the simulation time down to just at the error or slightly after it, and see and then try to isolate which portions of the floodplain are getting inundated, or which how far down the frontal wave promulgated was promulgated in the channel. Simplify the model. You can turn off some of the components, as I mentioned. If the problem component is identified, you could cut the data field in half, like for a channel or a street or levees or something. And then change where the inflow and outflow node is if you have had the opportunity to isolate the volume conservation or instability in the problem area. If you get an error message, that's a Fortran error message, and it says not a NaN, not a number, you could be exceeding something or dividing by 0 or whatever. If you see stars in your output, either in the output of Mapper or Maxplot, or in the summary.out file, maybe for volume conservation, this means that there's not enough digits being identified for the output. So you may need to make either the error is so big that it's exceeding the conditions of the modeling effort, or you're exceeding what output I made. It may just be 2 decimal places, and maybe you need more. Now, prior to running the model, we have embedded in the QGIS a debugging tool. So you could run the model for 0.1 hours, or just press this debug run to generate the debug output file containing warning messages and errors. The QGIS also does this by creating a QGIS debug.data file. The Flow2D model creates a debug model with this format. Now, I would say to you, I'm not sure how many other types of models there are that allow you to do a debug run or debug in your QGIS or in your GIS tools. But once the model has run and you've looked at this, then you can import the debug file directly into your aerial, into QGIS with your aerial imagery and see where the issues are and whether or not there are overlapping errors. Check the ones you would like to load, and layers will be created with them. So you might look at depressed elements, channel bank checks, changes in floodplain due to an elevation difference with an output file as it tries to adjust for some unreasonable data files. The debug display looks like this, and it tells you things like, is the X concentration exceeding the variable food number, so forth. And so we put all these checks not only in the model, but you can plot them directly by importing the debug file into QGIS. Now, I'm not going to go into this any further because Karen does this periodically every 2 or 3 months. She'll have a debug run or show you how to use the debug tools in QGIS. Now, when the model runs, the model Flow2D creates check files, and check files all have to do with checking warnings and error messages. It could be a fatal data error and it stops the model. You have to eliminate the error in order to continue. And these check files like error.check are self-explanatory and may indicate the location, the grid element number. If it's a warning message, the warning messages don't stop the execution. They may or may not be errors, and then you have to use your engineering judgment or modeling judgment to see whether or not you need to fix something. Now, I don't know how elaborate other modeling tools have, but I suspect that a lot of them are somewhat limited in this kind of data checking. And if you look at error.check after a good run and you've looked at summary.out, you have volume conservation is okay, and there's no evident surging that you saw, you might go to this file and it says no data input errors were encountered. Review any warning error messages above, and there's nothing there. On the other hand, if there is something there, then you need to pay attention to it. It might be warning messages having to do with the ARP values that might have been reassigned because you were exceeding the potential for storage in the grid element, or you have a mismatch with some of the infiltration variables or so forth. There are data errors in different files, perhaps like the hydraulic structure error, and it might tell you that the error in the hydraulic structure has to do with a rating curve or table, and it may make some adjustments for you to see whether or not you would like to use those adjustments in the model. Now, that's all I'm going to take it. I'm just trying to get in terms of the error debugging with QGIS, because we'll have an entire webinar on this. But in the uncommon event that you get a Fortran error, you may have divided by 0, or you're over exceeding the array allocation, or it's just a code bug. But if you can't find an obvious data error, then we need to help you. And what you need to do is send us the data file, maybe a screen capture of this so I don't have to run it right off the bat. And it says that the output error is in unit 2, the base.out file, and it's encountered with this particular cross-section subroutine on this particular line. So there's nothing you can do about this. It's a code problem. You send it to me, send me this, and we'll go over the model and with a fine-tooth comb and help you to identify the error. If you can't immediately do this, just send it to us. This is part of our tech support, and we're happy to entertain this. And it also helps us find error coding bugs that may not be intuitively found by our own test cases. We have about 50 simulations or something like that that Karen and Noemi have put together to test various components in the model. However, this we're always trying to upgrade the model and make the model run faster, and so sometimes in making some model revisions, we introduce a code bug that we don't see in our own test cases. Now, so that was a little bit on, hopefully your other models that you might be using give you this opportunity to do troubleshooting and debugging with some detail, because it certainly makes life simpler for you. I want to spend a few remaining minutes here in this webinar talking about project review. And the keys to project review are, if you're still developing the model, is the model project size, that is the number of grid elements, 2 million to 3 million, or even higher perhaps now. Maybe it's too large of a model to effectively address individual issues on a grid element by grid element basis. It's just hard to find and put in all of the data and so forth. You may need to select a smaller project size and have the outflow from one project simulation into a downstream project simulation, divide it along some reasonable boundaries or in the channels, and so forth. If you choose elements that are too small, you have to decide if the simulation time is too long, that you may want to make the grid elements larger. And you want to do this before you put a lot of urban detail into your model. So when you're developing the model, see how do a couple of preliminary runs before you put a lot of detail into it, building streets, levees, infiltration, and so forth. And run the model only until you see the issue become apparent. If the time steps are getting way too small, look at what output you're getting. Are you conserving volume? And if you are, then how far did the floodway progress before you started choking on and looking at the time.out file to identify what's holding things up. And just as a general overview for the runtime, you might see that the model components are not adequately distributing the flood. Maybe it's because you haven't run the model long enough, and so forth. So one of the issues that I see sometimes, taking a drink of water, that I see sometimes is, here's your project area and you have all of this inflow, whether from rainfall or from inflow hydrographs, coming down into an urban area. This is a simple plot, max plot, but it shows, and it's fast. I mean, you just click on max plot in your project file folder and zoom, you can look at this. You don't have to worry about importing images and so forth. But you see that the flow is along the boundary here. So then what I would do is I would turn on the outflow elements and see whether or not your outflow elements exist. And I did this in this project, and there are outflow elements along here. And this would mean that the flow is getting to the boundary and flowing off the grid system as normal depth, approximation of normal depth, so that you don't have to pull down or have backwater up through your system because you're debouching the water off your grid system with a critical flow depth criteria, which is clearly inappropriate here. I've created a way in which it can approximate numerical normal depth at the project boundary outflow nodes. But also what I noted in this particular project here is that the flow was along this boundary, but there were no outflow elements. And so I immediately called this into question, because if your flow goes against the boundary and there's no outflow nodes, this water is getting forced downstream, and it may be inappropriate if this is your project realm grid system and you were mostly interested in this particular area. You said, hell, I don't need any output nodes along this one. Well, it may not be the case because you're backing the water up with higher flow depths, maybe into your project area. It turned out, however, that along this boundary here was a railroad embankment that was like 18 feet high or something. So they just modeled this, and rather than um, putting in the actual levee component with high levees along the boundary, just let it flow along the boundary, because that's the reality. It never crosses the railroad embankment here. So that's kind of important. So if you get the model back, the quick check should be error.check. Are there any error or warning message? The simulation runtime, is it too long? Look at time.out. And then volume conservation, summary.out, ch volume for the channel.out. If it's conserving volume, your model ran fast, there doesn't appear to be any high velocities or Froude numbers in the model, maybe you're done. If you want to go into detailed checks, where are your inflow and outflow nodes located? Typically, you need to have a buffer between the inflow node and your important project features, or the outflow nodes and important project features. That's so that the water's getting on the system and has a chance to reach its own kind of essentially uniform, stable flow. And if you're too close to the inflow nodes, which should be essentially sacrificial nodes, or the outflow nodes, which may be attributing to the outflow at normal depth, and it's not really normal depth. These are some issues. You should give yourself enough grid elements from the interesting part of your project and the inflow and outflow nodes. Are the Mannings N reasonable? Or are you still using the default values and haven't put in any spatial variability? N values are more valid, and your model will run smoother if you have N values that reflect vegetation, channels, streets, and so forth. And then go to time.out again, which I showed you, and which elements are sticky, which ones are holding up the grid system. And then limiting Froude numbers. And this may be a troubleshooting tool that you can use that you may not find in other models, but it shows you that you can go to rough.out and look at N value adjustments in the output file, rough.out, in order to limit the Froude number being supercritical or high supercritical. And then once you've determined that your model had conserved volume, you're not sure if there's any instability, the hydrographs look good. Look at channel surging, perhaps with vel times c, listing the maximum velocities and the depth and time of occurrence, or for the floodplain, and then look at these with respect to where they're located in MaxPlot. Are the street velocities reasonable? This is where your highest velocities are going to be, most likely. And are these 50 feet per second, which is completely unreasonable, or are they just 2 or 3 feet per second, which without some kind of obstruction or backwater condition is probably too low for the street velocities. And maximum flood depths. When you're looking at maximum flood depths, just review the model quickly in MaxPlot or Mapper and see by the legend what some of the flow depths are. In this case here, the flow depths are like 20 or above 30 feet. And you could say, wow, how can I have 30 foot of depth on a model that where I know what this looks like? It's all open floodplain or urban area flow. I can't have 30 feet of flow depth. Well, it turns out that this is just on the other side of this channel here is a big mining pit that dips like to 100 feet or so, or 50 feet or so. And so what happened is the water came out of the river onto the floodplain, flowed under the highway. High 80 goes right through here and down the canyon in Truckee and Reno, Nevada. And it has these large flow depths because it filled up a portion of this excavation gravel mining hole here that existed. So review these, and if all the depths are 4 to 10 feet and they're in an area where you'd expect 4 to 10 feet, then maybe you don't have to review this, but this will help you to identify that. Then visual tools. Import things in the QGIS along with the mapping, and then use your street and levee profile tools to make sure that the flow shouldn't be getting outside the levee, for example, or maybe it's flowing down the street and ponding at the bottom for some reason. Look at grid element elevation rendering, grid element end values, and a levee editor again for whether the levee crest elevations and ground elevations are matching, or whether there's a hole in the levee. So when you do the flood maps, what do you want to look for? The area of inundation, depressions, which I just showed you, high depths. Sometimes these occur right along the channel because the channel bank element is picking up the elevation on the bottom of the channel. Ponded water. If you look at final flow depths, which I did with you on one particular project at the beginning of this webinar, if you look at ponded water, the water surface, and it's not moving because your velocities are near zero, that you should have a uniform water surface elevation for the ponded conditions with a final depth plot. If it's still flowing and moving around in the pond, it has to have some variability to flow. So if you're expecting it to flow out of the pond by overtopping a weir or something like this, or a reservoir, then you have to look at ponded flow and what's going on, whether you have high velocities in the ponded flow condition, which means that you're putting end values that essentially reflect a non-friction or frictionless flow, but in reality flow to these, well, the Manning's N representation of velocity as a function of roughness is not appropriate because it's not a turbulent velocity profile in the ponded conditions. So you may have to, for ponded depths in reservoirs or in bays, just put an artificially high end value so that the velocities are not dominated by the hydraulic radius to the 2/3 power in calculating the velocity and discharge in it. So ponded water, I have a reservoir water and ponded water conditions white paper, which will help you to identify whether or not the ponded water is realistic or not. And finally, you can look at a depth analysis in MaxPlot. At the bottom of the MaxPlot program, whether it's an older one, here we have a new dialog box with this page. But you can compare two files, the depth or velocity or some other output file, and it'll give you the difference between file 1 and file 2. So there may be differences. For example, that you're doing work on pre and post development conditions. Maybe you're putting in a new mall or something. Whether there's a difference with any flood hazard mitigation measures you may have designed. So this would be before and after the flood mitigation was put into the model. Differences maybe with using a different rainfall return period storm or something. Now what MaxPlot does when you select the project folders and then actually plot the maximum depth fp.out on the floodplain or something, it will generate for you this difference.out file. And then you can take this difference.out file into Mapper or QGIS to view it with a background image. And you can see by the legend what's going on with the differences in pre and post development or construction conditions. And here you can see some red values, so you might want to zoom in here, or some green values here with even lower flows to the outflow elements. Here you want to zoom in and see what's going on here. So this difference.output file is really valuable. And in the end, and using the difference.out file, you may want to plot it in Mapper or in MaxPlot. You may just make the the difference.out file, rename it to depthfp.out file if your mapper is trying to only allow particular output files to be plotted. In QGIS, I don't think it matters. Now finally, if you want to speed up the model, which is a common desire of all modelers, look at the function of the grid size and the discharge flux. Do it before you put in details in the model. If the model's running too slow and your discharge flux into your model, that is discharge per time, you'd want to look at whether or not you're choking the model at some point, and you need to make these changes at the start of the model. So if you're down to 1 meter grid elements, I can tell you right now that that's going to be too small, and your model's going to run really slowly. So when you get started, evaluate this condition. Now, one of the things you can do with the discharge flux and inflow to the model is to distribute it over several grid elements and have several inflow hydrograph areas. But these are all going to be sacrificial elements. Don't use the inflow nodes or the first 3 or 4 nodes downstream of the inflow nodes as project results. These are just sacrificial nodes that you're trying to get the discharge onto the grid system. If any instabilities are choking the model, look at that in VelTime FP or super.out files and fix any instabilities you might have. Again, I'm not doing this today. Look at our webinars on model stability and end values or something like that. I've forgotten what I entitled it. Address cells with issues, and that's the time.out file, which ones are choking the model. And if everything looks good, then just increase the stability criteria. Take Courant number from, maybe you had it 0.4 up at 0.6, 0.8, and then use the time step accelerator until you start seeing lack of convergence in your model. Okay, so that's the end of this. Again, my intent was, even though I've had to talk about Flow2D because that's what I'm familiar with, is that you can apply this kind of sequential analysis of your project. Don't be caught in the dilemma of just looking at the output results and seeing really nice pictures, velocities and flow depths associated with those nice pictures or animation, and think that the model is generating a stable volume conservation result. And if your model doesn't have volume conservation reporting in it, you're in trouble. Okay, let me see now if I can. I'm going to stop the recording here because